Ismael El Mayo Zambada, leader of Mexico's Sinaloa Cartel, pleaded not guilty on all charges after being arrested by US federal agents in Texas on Thursday. Also arrested Thursday alongside Mr. Zambada was the son of the notorious El Chapo Guzman, Joaquin Guzman Lopez.
So there's Mayo Zambada, but he just keeps going, and everyone eventually starts to say Chapo becomes a target, and Mayo Zambada ends up becoming incredibly powerful, but nobody had ever heard his name. The cartels have become extraordinarily militarized. It's one thing what the cartels try to keep in the mountains between each other, you know, and that's where they use perhaps some of their highest caliber weaponry that they don't want to be known publicly because it's a massive escalation. We're talking about like shoulder-fired missiles, Gatling guns, like miniguns. So it's basically, it's like a arms race between cartels and the Mexican government. And the cartels are definitely winning. And El Mayo Zambada was just coming up with Chapo at the time. Chapo back then was he was like a gunman of maybe a special group of sicarios, but he wasn't a big deal. And Mayo Zambada always sought to keep a low profile. Where Chapo's profile really exploded was when the cardinal, the Guadalajara, Jalisco Catholic cardinal, was shot dead at the airport. Mm-hmm. And they blamed it on El Chapo. And from there, his sort of trajectory of being chased by the law, he was kind of made a target. Whether or not he may have had anything to do with it, he was made a target. And
that was during the war between Sinaloa and the Tijuana cartel,
that's
correct?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the question, yeah. So there's Mayo Zambada, but he just keeps going, and everyone eventually starts to say Chapo becomes a target, and Mayo Zambada ends up becoming incredibly powerful, but nobody had ever heard his name. Mm-hmm. You know, he may have been in the top 10 of the DEA list, but nobody was paying attention to him. They were paying attention to El Chapo and the hundreds of shows and documentaries and series and
songs,
everything that was made about him, merchandise, mm-hmm. right? And so in a way, Mayo Zambada was able to do what he does by staying in that shadow and just let the attention be diverted elsewhere. And I would have never imagined. I mean, none of us had. We just imagined he would stay in the mountains of Sinaloa and die of natural causes.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy because it feels like that he was the only guy that had a chance of that ever happening in the game, as far as we know.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into the arrest then. From starting off at the top, he released a statement saying that El Chapo's son, maybe we should probably go to that first, but he released a statement essentially saying that El Chapo's son likely worked with authorities trying to work out some type of deal. Obviously, there isn't a ton of clarity in what that deal might be, but that he worked with Mexican authorities and U.S. authorities, and that's how El Mayo was able to get captured. What is your understanding of the current sentiment around that claim, and why do you think something like that may be occurring between, as you highlighted, two factions that have been working closely for decades now?
Well, what we do know is that El Mayo Zambada was in touch with U.S. government officials for years. And that was part of the way that he negotiated. I mean, he knew he had to perhaps keep his enemies close, but he was in touch with U.S. government for years. And so, I mean, there is the possibility of him turning himself in. I mean, one of the things he said in one of the only interviews he's ever done was that I would rather die than step foot in a prison. If he did turn himself in, there may have been other ways to do it. I don't know. It's just we've all been throwing this around. It's really hard to know what actually happened. Others say that he allowed himself. Others say that he was kidnapped. I've been told about his security detail that he had around him and the rings of security that he had around him to anticipate any possible abduction, assassination, anything. And so for him to be kidnapped is really hard to believe too. But then again, like Joaquin Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's son, is like a godson to El Mayo Zambada. So maybe he trusted him enough to kind of leave his security detail behind. And then was he, kidnapped, or was he tricked into getting onto the plane? Because if he was tricked into getting onto the plane, then perhaps, he could call off his security detail, right? And say, I'm getting on this plane with my godson, as opposed to them hog-tying him, But then there were these photographs that came out in USA Today of inside the plane, and there's zip ties on the seat of the plane, in the back seat.
I've not seen those yet, really.
Yeah. Some, great photographer, Omar Ornelas, there in El Paso, took photos of the inside of the plane. And so there's zip ties. What the hell are those doing there? We didn't see any that were cut or anything on the floor of the plane. But these are the kind of tiny details we're focusing on, because it's become a massive diplomatic row between the United States and Mexico. This arrest infuriated the Mexican government in ways that very little, I think, had infuriated them to this level during the past administration.
Well, so why so?
There's the one sort of big obvious reason, which is the previous president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who just left power, very, very recently, was a nationalist president and was always talking publicly about how Mexico's a sovereign country and the United States was not to infringe on that sovereignty. So when it came to security cooperation, it was, it was especially important to him, perhaps in ways not even, at least as publicly demonstrated in past administrations, that the U.S. government coordinate with Mexico, not just go pluck a drug lord of the importance of Mayo Zambada out of Mexico and not say anything. That's really embarrassing for the Mexican government if that version is true. And AMLO, as they call him, the president, he had sort of projected this image of Mexico not being influenced or manipulated by anyone. And so for this to happen with the most important drug lord of the past 40 years, forget about El Chapo, forget about all of these different drug lords, Ovidio Guzman, people in recent years, this was the most important drug lord, and nobody told him about it until he learns the guy is on a tarmac in El Paso. So that argument is he considered it, I think, a breach of sovereignty, if in fact that's what happened. Because he might be posturing and actually know, but need his base to
trust
think.
him more.
Yeah. He spoke out in defense of El Mayo Zambada in ways that were extraordinary, considering how many people Mayo Zambada is accused of having killed or ordered killed over the decades that he was the leader of the Sinaloa Cartel. And he spoke very much on procedure, but it was it was a bit surreal to see him speaking out in defense of a drug lord that he said should be brought back to Mexico. and that they shouldn't have done that. The U.S. ambassador said recently that, Mexico should be celebrating the capture of one of the most important criminals in Mexico. And Mexico hasn't seemed to be able to celebrate that, perhaps because they care more about sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the president has been in El Mayo Zambada's hometown in the mountains of Sinaloa more than any other president, I believe, in history.
That's kind of where I was about to go is, do you think there's also a sentiment there? I mean, we see it in pop culture. We see it in rumors that have circulated, like you said, all the way back to Felix Gallardo, that there's closer ties to levels of government officials than a lot of people would like to admit or even acknowledge. Is there some level of a mix of failing to keep the peace and a mix of failing to meet those expectations as well that you think certain government officials may be feeling with the capture of someone like El Mayo?
A mix of failing to keep the peace and a mix of government involvement in this, or collusion with the Sinaloa Cartel. Is that what I understand?
Essentially, yeah. For one of the more interesting ideas that I've seen, and again, we talked about Narcos kind of being but there was a really interesting line in there where when Felix Gallardo was arrested, I don't know if it's true, but he essentially said, now that the lion tamer is taken out, you get to see, all the animals let loose. A lot of times people think that, and there's levels to this where Mexican government officials are in the pocket of the cartels because they just want money. Partially at a level that may be true, but there's also this idea of if we have control of one, no matter if he's the biggest and we have control of him, at some level that controls everyone else. So is there a sense, I guess that kind of brings in with the idea of bringing the peace and also, the promise of security for that cartel or that leader. Do you think there's a sentiment there as well of a failure there?
There's no question that with El Mayo Zambada out of the game, that hundreds more, or at least that we know publicly, which is perhaps the tip of the iceberg, of people have died as a result. I mean, Sinaloa, the state alone, has been thrown into terrible turmoil. A relatively peaceful city, Culiacan, is now on, I can only think of the word in Spanish, but they have toque de queda at night. At 7, 8, 9 at night. The streets are empty and no one dares go outside. It was a very vibrant, dynamic city that has been kind of frozen in on lockdown, and tons of people dying. Murders every single day, tensions. And perhaps that was upsetting to the president, right? Because every time, like you said with Felix Gallardo, every time a major drug lord is taken out. And I think there are studies, I've read studies of this, where in a municipality, wherever a jefe of a plaza or of a territory or region is taken out, one, homicides increase in that area by 40, 50, 60% as the adjustments are being made and the fight for power happens. So every time one of those people are taken out, people die. And then often what happens is when you take one of these people out, like a Mayo Zambada or a Chapo, their groups splinter and you end up with more cartels than you had in the past. So you end up with more insecurity and more splinters demanding extortion or trying to defend their own little plaza. It just creates more death. And to that end, removing El Mayo Zambada, a guy who, within the cartel, they call him, a man of his word, which is hard to find. They they say, they like look back to the golden era of like capos who kept their word, and these young juniors, these young folks just, they'll like lament it. It's just like, it's not like it used to be, the good old days of the old Sinaloa Cartel. God, I wish we could have those back. They say. One of those big sort of representatives of that era who was known to keep his word, was known to look out for his people, is gone. And the kids are left to run the show. And the kids have grown up like super wealthy and privileged. They didn't grow up in the trenches like Chapo and Mayo Zambada, harvesting weed in the mountains of Sinaloa when they're 10 years old. They grew up in Lamborghinis. And the question is, now that they've been handed the reins essentially from their dads, how's it going to go? And it hasn't gone very well for El Chapo's sons, the Chapitos.
That's actually exactly where I was going to go. And maybe it's good to start with, we were saying he's extremely notorious, but some people may not really understand who El Chapo was and his relationship with Sinaloa and El Mayo. So if you could maybe paint that picture, and then from there, if we can carry into his arrest and his kids taking the reins of power and what we've seen over the past decade almost now, where they've kind of been in that power play, and what's happened there. So I guess starting with just laying the groundwork, like who was El Chapo and his relationship, with El Mayo and the Sinaloa Cartel as a whole.
So people knew him to be a smart entrepreneur and businessman, likable, if you're on his good side. And at a certain point in the early 80s, he went to Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo and he said, look, I kind of want my own piece of the pie here. Obviously I'm going to pay you your dues, but I want a section, I want a region. And he was asking Felix Gallardo, as many before him had done, for the protection of the Mexican government to traffic cocaine on his own, get some of his own dealers and shipments. And he began to do that, and he sort of had the Sinaloa cartels, especially horizontal business, where there can be silos, and the silos don't particularly talk to each other, so that like they're all kind of doing their own thing, like franchises. So Chapo began to grow his franchise, and that's part of the reason. That's part of the reason for their success is that you take one capo out, it doesn't mean the whole structure topples, right? It just means that there's that silo. They replace whoever's there, but there's all these other silos that continue to operate independently, and that works really well for them. So he did that to great success, and obviously he began to make millions and millions, and was in the Forbes, 500 richest people's list, and then along came his kids, and his kids, as it turns out, also particularly entrepreneurial, seem to have learned a lot from their dad, and really got into, according to, especially U.S. law enforcement, really got into the fentanyl trade. And there was a lot more money in fentanyl than in cocaine, or at least because the logistics of shipping cocaine it's a lot more bulky, right? And so they were able to just use the same trafficking routes, like El Chapo with his tunnels, having been known for digging tunnels and being really good at it and having the best engineers. I mean, they could just take over that kind of infrastructure from their dad and ship things that were far less bulky, like $1 million fits in a backpack. Actually, I don't know that.
I think you are correct.
I think it's something
legitimately,
to that effect.
Because how was it? Yeah, something akin to a small bottle is like 200,000. So it's definitely up in that range.
Yeah, so this is and you have an increasingly addicted audience or clientele. And say they grow up over time, but one of the things that the advent of fentanyl created was that it impacted the general population in the way that cocaine perhaps didn't quite get there. And they became notorious for, providing this product that was killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. Like cocaine, I think for a long time it's like known as something the rich could afford.
Yeah.
Right? And there's crack cocaine and things like that, but just cocaine, like it was something the rich could afford, and it just, to
there's something
me,
sexy about it.
Yeah, but fentanyl. I mean, there's something sexy about it, and when the rich are into it,
it's
cocaine,
okay.
and demand more of it, are they really gonna ask for their suppliers to stop? But then when you have fentanyl, which is so incredibly deadly, and increasingly so with the new recipes that they create, you suddenly come into this. You become known in a different way in the United States, and the United States has to do something about it. And for whatever reason, the Chapitos, because there are other groups that traffic a ton of fentanyl, like the Jalisco Cartel, they were the target, and they were the people that were to be taken down, and they were the group that was to be dismantled. And the United States is, in the past 6 years, and I say 6 years of this most recent president, that administration, the very end of the Trump administration, towards the end of the Trump administration, and into President Biden's administration, the United States made extraordinary efforts to dismantle the Chapito network. And, just as an aside, I think, or at least I've seen a lot of people assume that the cooperation between the United States and Mexico is perhaps at its lowest level that it's ever been, or, just like security cooperation because of the rhetoric towards Mexico and things like that. From my reporting, the cooperation is extraordinary.
In what ways?
Well, they're taking down some of the biggest targets. The U.S. is helping Mexico take down some of the most important targets. For example, let's just use the Biden administration as an example. The biggest targets have been methodically taken down, and they have been hitting the structure, of the Chapito dominion, of this Chapito network. Last year in 2023, I think, was the 5th greatest number of extraditions from Mexico to the United States in the past 20 years.
Really?
Yeah.
And this is mid-level guys, or who are we talking about?
We're talking about everyone. I mean, there's big names.
Yeah.
But we're talking about United States making requests to Mexico, this sovereign nation that this president has said, needs to really keep the United States in its place, extraditing more people to the United States last year than in almost any other year in the past 2 decades. That's an extraordinary fact.
Yeah.
And people don't realize.
That.
No, and people, I think, really assume that Mexico is less interested in working with the United States after suggestions about the Mexican people from presidential candidates and presidents, that Mexico isn't doing enough. Mexico isn't sending its best people. All of this rhetoric. The cooperation is relatively extraordinary. It's there's the political rhetoric is over in this universe over here. And then there's a security cooperation just humming along and getting better and better.
Do you think that it's the actual governments themselves working together, or would you think that it's maybe some of these security agencies, CIA, whatever the exact example would be for Mexico, maybe them working behind closed doors to reach some of these deals or to make some of these operations go through?
I mean, it all happens with the full and express knowledge, permission and knowledge of the Mexican president, past and current. But I think what was really important under a president with that kind of nationalist rhetoric in Mexico was to do your job without making any waves and perhaps not even taking the credit for it. Just let others take the credit. And in that way, just, like a good bureaucrat or a good law enforcement officer, just like put your head down and do the work and not try to bring attention to yourself. And that's what U.S. law enforcement has done to great effect in the past 6 years, and to your point, like 10 years. I think it really started under the Trump administration, where it was clear that there was a need for kind of to separate yourself from what like the political rhetoric was between the two countries and what actually needed to happen in terms of security priorities for both countries.
So jumping back in here, we're just talking about this, but with the whole situation, kind of the key player on the other end of El Mayo was El Chapo's son. And there's kind of two notable ones. So could you maybe speak to both the sons, the role they've kind of played in the Chapitos faction over the past, like we were saying, 10 years, and kind of what, the arrest of Ivan and all these different things that have been happening as well?
Yeah. Well, perhaps the one that was the most sort of visible was Ovidio Guzman, who, early on into the previous administration, 2019, the Mexican military did this raid in Culiacan to capture Ovidio Guzman. And I think it's the difference between when you see nothing happen and a big drug lord is captured, and when you see all hell break loose in a drug. One often suggests that there was an arrangement, like in Mayo perhaps turning in El Chapo. He was taken down with almost no casualties, whereas it seemed clear that nobody was turning in Ovidio Guzman in 2019 when the military went into Culiacan and the Sinaloa Cartel was basically like, you're in our hometown. We haven't agreed to this, so we're going to make sure that you get out. And so they blocked, I think, every major exit to the city or entrance to the city with buses on fire. They brought out their big guns. They brought out their 50 caliber, weapons that can fire up to, I think, like 2 miles or something. And they're in the back of their trucks. And I mean, it was this very, very open display in a city that kind of keeps it just under the surface. And just people with weapons everywhere, kidnapping. You basically have the military going in the middle of the day and going in and actually succeeding in capturing Ovidio Guzman, El Chapo's son. But that's as far as it gets, because then they basically have Sinaloa Cartel has the Mexican military in checkmate. They have captured and kidnapped a number of soldiers and family members of soldiers. And basically, we're like, if you don't release Ovidio Guzman, we're going to kill the families of your soldiers. And they had like, I don't know, a few hundred people released from prison to fight on the streets. I mean, everything. You just suddenly realized just how much control the Sinaloa Cartel has in a major Mexican city like Culiacan, where they took over and they shut everything down.
I saw videos as well of the soldiers and the sicarios like coming together. Like there was like one point where they were sitting there and the soldiers were just kind of like,
yeah,
you guys are good.
Yeah, I mean, I saw those as well, and I think they're unverified, but that's also kind of how it works.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it is true that that's exactly what happened there, because I saw others where they were shaking hands with the soldiers, just like, you know, being really cordial and saying hello, and yeah, we're all both doing our job here, aren't we? Yeah. Except one of us is winning.
Yeah.
Right? Just like,
good point.
You know, it's cool. Like, you're good. We're gonna win, and then everything will go back to how it should be, which it did. And the president made the decision to have him released, saying that he wanted to avoid additional bloodshed. And I think that happened. They avoided additional bloodshed. It also is true that it was one of the lowest sort of moments in terms of morale for the Mexican military at the beginning of this administration, who had as a motto or a slogan, in Spanish, it's abrazos no balazos, which is to say hugs, not bullets. And this was the first sort of, whether or not the president meant it to be this way, it was the first indication to many people within the Mexican military that he really meant that he was going to hug the cartel members instead of shooting at them. And it was incredibly demoralizing.
I was just about to ask that.
Yeah, so that set the tone for the Mexican military during AMLO, as they know him, the president's administration. In a way, it set that tone, at least for the rank and file, because they were seeing this messaging. He would come out in his unprecedented morning press conferences that he did religiously throughout 6 years. And he did to great effect, where he said, you know, this is our strategy. We're going to go to the roots of this violence and help support the young people and getting better jobs and things like that. And we're not going to have this huge war on drugs that had been the case for the previous two presidents, where they'd really confronted the cartels head on. I don't know if equally, you know, to all the big cartels, but they made a show of force that this president seemed not to want to do. And by releasing Ovidio Guzman, or ordering his release, was making good on his promise of hugs rather than bullets. That's how they saw it within the Mexican military. The Mexican military did not forget that and has a long memory. The Mexican military has a very long memory. And so they methodically now knew that one day they were going to take down Ovidio Guzman and to some extent recover a bit of their pride, or their, what's another word for it? Dignity. And the second operation was methodical, strategic, and surgical. They did not go in the middle of the day. They went at like 4 a.m., which is kind of typical for them to do. And I know very little about special forces, but I think it's like
normal operation time, because
everybody's sleeping.
Your guard's down.
Yeah. And they went in and took Ovidio out. And this time too, Ovidio at that point was such a, again, kind of in like his dad in a way, but at a shorter timeline, was much more of a target, much more well known. It was his first failed arrest, or his first failed, I guess you could call it failed capture and release, was such an embarrassment internationally for Mexico, who is already supposed to be looking tough on crime, and then this happens. He was just kind of done. When you're a target of the Mexican military and you are in some way responsible for their embarrassment, then I think it's only a matter of time. And they took him out, and man, I hope this doesn't keep up.
It's all good if you need like a second.
They took him out and extradited him in a very short amount of time.
I remember reporting on that. They had him on the plane like within the hour, catching him and throwing him right on.
They took him out of Culiacan, had him in Mexico City, and then extradited him to the United States. It took a little while. I mean, I think months, but it could take 5 years to get someone out. And that was another example of the extraordinary cooperation between the United States and Mexico.
So let me ask with that then. So going back to El Mayo and kind of the relationship between that faction and the Chapitos, for a long time, you kind of mentioned fentanyl, which is kind of probably one of the areas that we could highlight as well. But there, especially since El Chapo's arrest, there has seemed to be some growing resentment and I don't want to say growing pains because Sinaloa is obviously very established, but just working relationship wasn't as smooth as it used to be. So at what level, from your time working and like kind of hearing all the different, whether it be rumors, whether it be direct reports, where was that breakdown in that relationship started? And, how did that continue to compound maybe into what we're seeing today?
Between the Chapitos and El Mayo?
Yeah.
I think they had a different approach. I mean, we started out at the beginning of the show, we were talking about, I mentioned the code of honor. And I think El Mayo's old guard kind of approach may not have jived so much with the younger generation. They may have thought he's a bit too old school to really understand the current market. And the current market is far more dynamic. Now you're moving fentanyl pills in a much faster, much more agile way, perhaps making more money. And then you have I think it's just a classic generational thing, The old guys don't understand what it's like today. And the old guy's like, my God, kids today, And so yeah, there was a lot of reporting of a conflict between Mayo and the kids, Chapitos. But there was also a suggestion that it was much more about the mid-level to lower ranks that were sort of jostling for power. And the Chapitos had maintained a certain level of respect for Mayo. But then you contrast that with people saying that Mayo at least allowed for Chapo to be arrested without shutting down Culiacan. Mm-hmm. I wasn't in Culiacan, but in Sinaloa, shutting down everything and stopping El Chapo from being arrested. And the kids could see that as turning him in. So it's hard to say. It's hard to get into the mind of these various criminals. But they maintained at least a cordial relationship. And I think they shared trafficking routes and logistical support as well.
So going to some of these betrayals we talked about as well, I know there's some rumors that circulated around El Mayo's son's arrest. I'm not quite sure. And maybe you could break down what happened there, because I know that's obviously in its own right was kind of a big blow to the Sinaloa Cartel, El Mayo specifically. And again, there were some rumors that El Chapo may have had some play with that. There's all this stuff that circles around, and that's why it's kind of I want to paint that full picture before we get into now these factions starting to heat up a little bit. But what was this, or what was the situation there for El Mayo's son's arrest?
So, I'm less familiar with the case of Vicentillo, but what is, again, suggested, and it's almost like reading tea leaves of the underworld, right? Is that he essentially, he may have turned himself in, or he may have just been like, I'm going to do my time and then get out. And that is essentially what happened. I mean, it worked, right? He testified against El Chapo and reduced his time, and now has maintained a low profile. El Mayo's other son, Mayito Flaco, is presumably carrying on the baton of his father. But Vicentillo, played this out, did some time. Some people suggest he could essentially played the U.S. justice system by testifying and then, getting a reduced sentence, and he's still young enough to enjoy his freedom and probably a lot of money along with it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems that the junior narcos, when we say juniors, it's the seniors, the fathers, and the kids. The junior narcos are like perhaps increasingly into this idea of going to the U.S., doing their time, and then having a clean slate. I mean, look at El Chapo's son, Joaquin Guzman. He turned himself in, bringing a big fish.
This is exactly where I was going to go with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
The report is, as we highlighted off the top, El Chapo's son Joaquin was whatever, this is, again, something that it's probably going to take years until the full story comes out, but essentially he brought Mayo, they jumped on the plane, hopped off. Mayo didn't want to get arrested, while Joaquin was more than happy to be arrested. So continue with what you were saying, but like highlighting that as kind of the higher picture.
Yeah, I mean, he's essentially trusting in the U.S. justice system to allow him a much reduced sentence compared to the destruction that fentanyl and the Sinaloa Cartel has wrought on the United States. And, typically you go and you're like, look, I can tell you guys everything to get you to the biggest guy in the world. In my world, the biggest fish, I'll get him. He just brought him physically. It doesn't get any better. They don't even have to chase the guy. They don't even have to follow this guy's information. They don't have to check to see whether he's right there. So doing that, I think, will likely ensure him a pretty favorable sentence if history is any indication of that, and how other drug lords have played it in the past. So many people got their sentences reduced just for testifying against El Chapo. I mean, he alone, being in the courtroom, was responsible for allowing the freedom of so many drug lords before their time.
I guess this brings us to kind of the main sentiment as well. I do want to talk about the war on the ground that's kind of developing slowly, maybe not slowly anymore, but within Sinaloa with these two factions, what we just kind of laid the groundwork there. There's been decades of kind of somewhat animosity brewing while also, the relationships were still close. But, this kind of seems like the one that's kind of setting it off in a number of different ways. But before getting there, I do want to ask kind of one key question. How has cartel warfare changed? So you were highlighting a lot of the older members, we'll say the golden days of, the 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, whatever it might be. We've seen cartel activity explode, militarization explode. So I guess, can you build a picture of what warfare between cartels was like back then and kind of how warfare has evolved into what we're seeing today?
Yeah. The cartels have become extraordinarily militarized, not only in their weaponry, but in their other tactical gear and in their training. So it's one thing what the cartels try to keep in the mountains between each other, and that's where they use perhaps some of their highest caliber weaponry that they don't want to be known publicly because it's a massive escalation. And the Mexican government then has to respond to it and things like that. We're talking about like shoulder-fired missiles, Gatling guns, like miniguns, and what else? I mean, we know the 50 calibers, right? Because those started to come out. But that's what happens. Like the 50 cals, those sort of long-range bullets the size of cigars kind of weapons were not allowed to be made public. The cartel didn't allow that exposure for a while until slowly they came out and everyone just kind of got used to it. Now it's a run-of-the-mill. Those weapons are insane.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to get. I mean, I know you can get them here in the United States, but it's not easy. It's not even, I understand that like you even need special like target ranges because of how powerful they are. And they're hard to find in the United States. You can't just go to any like shooting range and fire a 50 caliber weapon. Those are run of the mill in Mexico now. They're everywhere. So the next thing, and I reported on this, is that miniguns are starting to appear now. A minigun, 6-barreled minigun, can take down or can destroy a small car, some say in a matter of seconds, depending on what you call destroy. It can totally immobilize a vehicle.
Yeah, everyone in the vehicle is dead too.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like obliterated. And those miniguns are now used by the inner sort of most elite circle of security for the biggest drug lords in Mexico. Those aren't even for sale in the United States publicly. It's my understanding. You can't buy one. The Mexican cartel has the extraordinary privilege of getting any number of them. They've been showing up on crime scenes now, and I did the reporting, and then the miniguns now, based on the reporting that I've done, quite common. But they're very careful about not bringing them out into the open because it, again, creates an escalation. But the ATF director, most recent ATF director, said, I think it was in June 2023, he's like, we have Gatling guns in the hands of cartels now. I did the story for the Wall Street Journal of the top most preferred weapons for cartels and for what missions. And of course I mentioned the Gatling gun or the minigun, the 50 caliber, and how they use them. And people were like outraged. They were like, I can't even have one of those, and they were like, no, they were like, there's like this righteous fury that like, you could have them south of the border, but you can't have them up here because, all of these gun enthusiasts. So they're using those. And those in Mexico, when it comes to the military, they primarily have them mounted on like Blackhawks, right? And there's for special operations. And even the Mexican military was like, didn't use them that much, but you would see like amateur videos of them at night just strafing a house, right? But there was like a few, it wasn't a lot. Then of course, for Ovidio's arrest, just like,
yeah, they were everywhere.
yeah. And so it's basically, it's like a arms race between cartels and the Mexican government. And the cartels are definitely winning. There are, I did reporting on this, and I had a number of people tell me about, shoulder-fired missiles, including the Javelin.
The Javelin as well.
Yeah.
That where are they getting these type of weapons from?
I have to be careful here because there's a suggestion that there are javelins out there, and there was good indication that there might be. And I went to close to the top to talk about it. Look, in Iraq, there were a number of javelins that were lost or unaccounted for. I believe the Washington Post reported like 35 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is back in like 2003, 4, 5, 6. And they eventually ended up in the hands of like ISIS members. Some of them. So if they're ending up in the hands of criminals in the Middle East, it's not that difficult for them
to make it.
I mean, someone somewhere is like exploding. Their head is exploding because it is really difficult to get a javelin, and not even I understand how incredibly hard it is to get a javelin. But these javelins are landing in hands of criminals around the world, even if there are very few of them.
Yeah, I mean, the situation, what happened in Afghanistan is obviously popularized. I mean, we left tons of equipment over there. They already have pipelines of, getting certain drugs from those regions as well. We're dealing with some of the richest individuals in the world. Yeah, I'm sure they can figure out to, ship stuff over and kind of create that black market as well. It's just, and this is what we were talking about before we got on the podcast today. It's just profound that they're so heavily militarized. I mean, regardless if there's 2 or 100 javelins,
right?
The fact they have things like miniguns, the fact that they have things like 50 caliber rifles that are relatively standard at this point.
Yeah.
I've seen, and we're going to talk about CJNG in a little bit, as well as, they will have mile-long convoys of just hyper-militarized vehicles. It's just incredible that they are able to get so many of these weapons and utilize them in a state of war, essentially, consistently.
Yeah. Yeah. It's extraordinary. And nobody's stopping this arms race. And they're only going to get more. I mean, again, and I want to say this very clearly, there were suggestions that there are javelins in Mexico. There's some evidence pointing to it, but I want to be really careful to say, like, certainly there are shoulder-fired, they have grenade launchers, they have rocket launchers. There's tons of those who've been found. A red man pad was found. And you're right. I mean, the weaponry that they have is, it allows them extraordinary control over a country, and now they're starting to use landmines, like a ton of landmines in Mexico.
Really?
Yes, they will line roads with landmines. They're blowing up military convoys with them. Essentially a truck with like 4 or 5 soldiers gone. They're now using drone bombs. Drone bombs are super prolific. I talked to a kid who was inside the Jalisco Cartel who watched one little town that refused to evacuate and give their town over to the cartel. I believe it was the Jalisco Cartel. It was in Michoacan. It was in Guerrero. And he said he saw in a period of 24 hours 200 drone bombs dropped on one town. 200
drone bombs.
Yeah. And they're little, like, artisanal. I don't know they're like
the camera type one, like the smaller.
Well, there's these drones with these, like, they have these bomb factories where they make landmines, and they like the bombs, and then they make these little, like, drone bombs, like held by a drone that is released, and it drops, and it doesn't seem. I mean, they're like amateur, explosives, And they just make a ton of them. Drones are everywhere. And they started to use them now in the fight between the Mayo Zambada faction and the Chapito faction in that war. But drone bombs are like another level, man, because it's the terror that communities face. For example, I'll give you an example. There's a mountainous pueblo in the state of Guerrero. Lawlessness up there. Nobody's going to look out for these people, essentially. I mean, it's really hard for the military to even get in there. It's so dangerous. And they refused to form part of that particular cartel. The cartel responded by just bombing the hell out of this community, and the 250 people left. Eventually, 80 people returned and are just defying the cartel, and they're paying the price of death for it. People are dying. People are getting shot. People are getting disappeared and bombed. And nothing happens. That level of weaponry, that level of sophistication, and the ability to act with such impunity is, I think, a harbinger of the rule of law and where things are going in Mexico.
Is this every cartel at some level? I mean, Sinaloa is obviously the big bad. It's always kind of talked about, and, you can debate. There's tons of cartels, but, is this something that you got to be Sinaloa Cartel to have, or are you even looking at some of the smaller, southern ones or whatever it might be, like some of the, ones that are infighting between CJNG and Sinaloa? Like, is it all of them that are kind of have these capabilities?
I don't know about all, but you don't have to be the Sinaloa Cartel to have drones with bombs. Mm-hmm. That's the case in Michoacan, the state of Michoacan, where it's the Familia Michoacana. They're not nearly as big as the Sinaloa Cartel or Jalisco. They're regional cartels that have these weapons. You have, and when you're talking about like Gatling gun, miniguns, that's harder to get. So you're talking about like the really, really big dogs that have those weaponry. And the SAW. Familiar with the SAW?
Yep.
M249?
Yep.
Like that kind of weaponry is almost like, someone told me it's like the Gucci bag of like guns for the cartel. Because if you have one of those, it's just an immediate status symbol. But they have the SAW. You should have seen the emails we received when I did because I included the SAW in the weapons that cartels prefer and for what reason. They're like, no, you don't get to have a SAW, man. And they do.
That's unbelievable. I mean, again, yeah, I mean, this is what we were talking about. I feel like a lot of Americans don't even realize. I mean, the drone thing, like I heard rumors about it. And I've seen it, but everywhere. I didn't realize it was to this level.
Oh, no. It's one of the most prolific sort of weapons of choice in some southern states in Mexico.
Are they using it against each other? Are they using it against the military? I mean, it sounds like they're using it against just straight up civilians as well as it. So that's kind of the main.
They use it against each other for sure. Mm-hmm. They use landmines against each other. There's literally, and they're using these drone bombs. Can I say drone bombs? Is that like, I think that's...
It's accurate. I mean, yeah.
Because they're not drones that crash into houses. They're drones with like...
That drop...
munitions that they drop. That they use against the population to terrorize people and have just cleared enormous swaths of like one particular state in the mountains. They've just taken over land by bombing the residents until they leave. Nobody's going to fight back. And how do you fight back against those drones? Mm-hmm. What's the military going to come in and try to target a drone? So it's very effective in terrorizing a population. So they use it often in that regard. Landmines, they will mine an entire one particular road that is strategic to like a stronghold. And I spoke to one person who said he knew of like 60 landmines along one particular route. You just couldn't go in. And so the population only has one way in and out that is entirely controlled by the cartel. So in that way, they're controlling populations perhaps in ways rarely seen before in Mexico.
For the people, I mean, is there a level of morale that's lost in any idea of this conflict, seeing any type of resolution, with the fact that they're becoming more hyper-militarized than ever? The warfare is getting more brutal, more bloody, more technologically advanced with things like drones. Like, how are the people on the ground, these cities you're highlighting that are being terrorized? I mean, how do they look at this whole situation as well?
They no longer go to the Mexican government for justice. They go to the Chapo, the local Chapo. So I think it's so far beyond, in some places, an expectation that the government would do anything. And it's not, and the government often is a part or in collusion in these places, like in the mountains of Guerrero. So they actually really appreciate a benevolent drug lord very much.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And the drug lord, the capo or the leader of the region is more than not the one who delivers justice. If someone has invaded your land, you don't really go to the local prosecutor or to the police. And the police are very likely already working for the drug lord, so why not go to the person who controls everything? And they do, and they go to them for justice. Mm-hmm. There's meetings, there's appointments on certain days of the week where you can go in front of, instead of the mayor, the local leader, and the leader will take notes and ensure that whatever they decide happens. They may not get justice for you for whatever reason, but the chance is much better than at the local magistrate.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask this then. We're going to deep dive CJNG in a little bit, because they're, in a lot of ways, have kind of recalibrated the way cartel warfare is going as well. But I don't know if it's still ongoing. I imagine it probably is. I feel like it never stops. But the war between Sinaloa and them in Chihuahua, was that? There was a territorial region I know that there was a massive conflict over. Obviously, just like with anything, civilians are caught in the crossfire. Speaking of that one specifically, is there allegiance to the civilians, or is it kind of whoever has the region at that time that's the boss we'll go to for these issues or whatever it might be? Like, how do the people there feel about whatever leader's in charge, or kind of the warfare that's happening there?
Like any good business, the Jalisco Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel have their social responsibility departments, in which they allot a certain amount of their income towards providing for the general population in the region, and divided out by regions. But like the Jalisco Cartel in some states will go through and kind of do surveys and find out what the population needs. In some places, it's water cisterns. In other places, it's metal roofs. In other places, it's a new road. And they put in that infrastructure. And in that way, garner goodwill, certain amount of goodwill among the people. So it's almost like an exponential problem, because in these regions, cartels are increasingly interested in municipal budgets. We could get a little into the minutiae and bureaucratic here, but it's really important. They care very much about municipal public works budgets, and they care about the security chief of that, police chief of that area.
So in what way? You say, so in the nuances of that, how do you... With
the budget, they want to control a portion of that budget because that's a lot of money that the mayor of that area has sole discretion to divvy out to contractors. These cartels often have their own road construction contractors, their own companies. So this money goes into their coffers one way or another. So they're starting to realize that at a municipal level, there's a lot of money to be had from the municipal coffers.
So they're basically the government's paying them to do the government work.
Yes.
That's great.
It is. And that's the problem, is that what the people see in that area, in that community, is the government is doing very little, but suddenly, and they know who's who. They know who's actually building the road. They're your neighbors. They're your cousins. They're your brothers and sisters in some cases. They know what's going on, and they see that the government is basically doing less and less, and the cartel is doing more and more. Maybe not really good roads, but at least they're putting in a road, right? Because certainly they're not going to allow inspectors. So you have this, you asked about the people and how they see it and are they demoralized? And it goes back to the justice thing too. You see the government doing less and less, but the government is more and more controlled by the cartel or taken over, the budget is more and more taken over by the cartel. So you're creating a shell over here that appears to be doing less and less. So when the cartel appears to be doing more and more and more over time, they're bringing you blankets, they're bringing you metal roofs, steel roofs, they're putting in a new road. The municipal government isn't doing that. Who do you think they're going to appreciate? And they've given up a long time ago in government functioning. That is like...
out the door.
Yeah. The only thing they want now is just for some basic infrastructure, books for their schools. And that is what, in many places, organized crime provides. So the only thing they can hope for is a group that has some semblance of care for them. And they're grateful.
That's incredible. I mean, I guess adding to this, this is kind of where I was going to go with the next stop on this, is not only has the cartel war become extremely hyper-militarized, and I'd be really interested if you could speak to where this kind of began. I know Zetas and El Chapo were kind of...
Yeah.
But it's become hyper-violent.
Yeah.
At levels that, I dare to say you don't even see outside of maybe a group like ISIS. And you go to major cities within Mexico and you can see, beheadings, corpse, whatever it might be. Where did that hyper violence start from? And how has it kind of continued to compound into what we're seeing to today?
The first, perhaps you could say, ISIS-style video came out in around 2008, 2009, I believe, where it was a very public show of violence in which some Zetas were kneeling and essentially just taken out on camera. And that was the first real, appeared to be almost like an imitation of what we were seeing in places in the Middle East and what ISIS was doing. Since then, they only escalated because they saw that kind of public fear tactic working. And the Zetas really took that over. The beheadings and things like that increased. And then the Jalisco Cartel, I think, took it even further. But also not just videos of, these ghastly killings, but also a show of force. So the Jalisco Cartel will do these videos, with these just mutant vehicles that are entirely bulletproof. Some of them even have oxygen chambers inside of them in case they have to seal them off from some chemical attack. They have drone deflectors, these radars that drones can't come in a certain area. these kind of vehicles, they have these vehicles and you see them, you find them on crime scenes, but they also take these videos of like everyone, these massive weapons and these huge mutant vehicles and things like that. That all started from, well, I don't know if it all started from one video, but it went from one video to slowly escalating over time. Now in this past administration, I was going to say maybe it wasn't quite as visible, but I think it was. But I think you had less of the government taking out, like, parading big capos in front of cameras and having this sort of full-on confrontation, like frontal confrontation with the cartels. And in that regard, there was less of a, like, in some cases, a show of defiance against the government itself and fear tactics. But it also allowed the groups to grow perhaps in ways that they had never had the ability to grow before.
So speaking about the hyperviolence, again, just following this topic, you see a lot of those videos that are on kind of the darker ends of the internet. Don't really recommend anyone going to watch them if you're not.
Neither do I.
Not necessarily following the topic, but what do you think their goal is with some of these videos? Because, for being fully transparent, there's videos out there of them cutting up the hearts of individuals and eating hearts and just brutal torture that is out there for a number of different reasons. I mean, what do you think their end goal is with posting those on social media and, whatever different website?
I think it's a message to their enemies. And I also think it's a message to the general population that, like, you need to give up. And, you should just know that we are going to control you through fear. And this is how far we're willing to go. I mean, they're trying to essentially outdo each other with the grotesqueness of the videos. And they get worse and worse and worse. And they have these sort of psychological aspects to them, even making people do things on camera that are just, I think, beyond the imagination of most decent human beings. And it is a matter of control. And you know what? Nothing is going to happen to them. Nothing. One or two of them might be taken out eventually, but, like, they can continue to escalate this with very little repercussion from the government. And so they will continue to one-up each other. And the question is, where does it end?
Mm-hmm. So looking at a lot of times when we talk about these cartels, we're talking about El Chapo, Mayo, Mencho, the top kingpins. You might even get to, like, the mid-level guys, people like El Russo, just, mid-level. But the guys that we're talking about with this hyper-militarization, the guys that are facing the hyper-violence day to day, that are being killed, that are being tortured, that are facing all these different, are the sicarios. Can you maybe detail first, obviously, what is a sicario, but then also who these people are? In a way, they're oftentimes taken advantage of or utilized by the cartels as somewhat cannon fodder, somewhat, in general, taken advantage of. So can you maybe speak to, what are the sicarios and kind of that average person, what they look like?
Yeah. So the very sort of entry level into a cartel profile can be kids, 13, 14 years old. You get these very rudimentary weapons. Sometimes they're just a welded tube, with a little, like, firing pin that will, like, fire a shotgun shell or something. And you are recruited and contracted, and you're the greatest cannon fodder. out there and contracted to do these low-level things like maybe kill a taxi driver, which will have almost no repercussion for you, or like a market merchant. So there's like low-level kind of easy targets where these people, perhaps to say it crassly, they don't matter. And you'll be okay for the most part. You practice on them. People can't fire back. And you aspire to, say, a .22 pistol. It's a real gun. And you slowly work your way up. And over time, it really is like a scheme in which they want to rise up through the ranks. You have bigger weapons. You get paid a bit more. You get a bit more trust. All of these things where perhaps in your community, well, as a kid, you're very susceptible and vulnerable, and you have these people you can look up to. So that's kind of one particular recruitment pool. Another is, like I once for a story that I did, talk to an accountant for the Sinaloa Cartel. During the pandemic, I was looking at how the Sinaloa Cartel as a business had basically been far more agile than any other company in the world. All of the shipping supply chain routes were like shut down. Meanwhile, the Sinaloa Cartel is just humming along, no problem at all.
Business.
Yeah, like borders are shut down, airports are very limited capacity. Ports of entry in the United States are very, very, very reduced, and so it's really easy to spot anything that's an anomaly or anything. So I'm talking to this accountant, and I assumed this person would be pretty well-to-do, right? He was responsible for a lot. He was responsible for tracking the shipments coming in from Colombia into Mexico and up into the United States. I mean, he was keeping track of tons and tons and tons of cocaine every week. The guy was making maybe like $500 a month.
No shit.
Yeah.
$500 a month.
And he wanted to rise up through the ranks. I was like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? He's like, I want a promotion. He's like, I want to get up to, and he had started out like a sicario like anyone else. But in a country where employment is difficult, income, is hard to come by, good jobs are hard to come by, the Sinaloa Cartel or any other cartel is often a place of employment that so many people aspire to, because you can quickly improve your situation in life, even if it may be a short life that you have. But you think about it, it's like, I could live well. I could have $500 a month for a little while, or I could have $60 a month for the rest of my life, for, decades.
Mm-hmm. You're going to pick the 500.
I mean, it looks kind of good,
So something I see a lot, though, is they talk about these sicarios. And I think that's a very interesting point that, some may become accountants and whatever it might be, but the ones that become the soldiers on the ground fighting, oftentimes people talk about they're consistently drugged up. They're sleepless. They're probably not eating as much as they should, or eating healthy food, whatever it might be. The mind goes pretty crazy under those conditions as well. And, I'll hear numbers that their average lifespan's like 90 days or something outrageous. Like they're, what do people think about when they hear that's the life that people are living?
Which people are we talking about?
I guess the ones that like the soldiers that are on the ground doing like the direct fighting, like we were talking about with CJNG versus, Sinaloa and I think it's Chihuahua. Again, I could be incorrect about that, but
yeah,
the ones on the ground fighting, they're monitoring the routes, they're getting into the gun battles, like they're really hitting it hard as a soldier of one of these cartels.
I don't know if I'm answering your question, but they know that their life is short. They're fully aware of that. And oftentimes they care the most about their mother. and their parents, and putting money aside for their family, because they know that they themselves have little time to live, statistically speaking. And so they burn the candle at both ends and know that, once you're in, you can't leave. I mean, you leave, you're dead. So, and when you're in, you get a salary that you perhaps didn't have when you weren't a part of it. And they put away money for their families. For example, migrant smuggling has, the return on investment is like said to be far greater than drug trafficking. So a lot of cartels, yeah, it's far more lucrative.
Why so?
Because there's fewer logistics and nobody's really doing much to stop them. So whereas cocaine is or fentanyl, is like the trafficking routes, you need to buy people off the whole way. You need to you need to have all these people along the way. You need to have tractor trailers for cocaine or something. You have to have all these shipping, and getting into the United States is really difficult. Whereas migrants, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. And there's not really, the interest in protecting their human rights is perhaps much less than the average citizen in Mexico. So nobody's really looking out to ensure cartels don't mess with the migrant population. Mm-hmm. And they've taken over almost entirely and basically use the same trafficking, smuggling routes for cocaine or for drugs, and now just run loads and loads and loads of migrants. And I was talking to a migrant smuggler, actually up in Chihuahua. And I was like, this actually goes to your point about like someone who sees that they're not going to have that much time here on this earth. What do they do and what do they think? It's like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Like asking a young entrepreneur or something. He's like, a new home for my mom, and I want her to have a nice car. In fact, he said, I've already begun building her home. He makes $6,000 per migrant that he crosses.
6,000 USD or?
USD.
Holy crap.
And it's just literally, it's crossing the border. He would run them through the sewer system from Juarez into El Paso. But that's what he thought about. And it's dangerous work. Maybe not as dangerous as drug trafficking, but it's dangerous. And he just wanted to save up enough money for his mom. For himself too, but you could really tell, like he didn't have to tell me that. But
yeah, he knew that most likely.
Was he trying to make me like him more? It just came out so naturally. Like for my mom and my family. He didn't say for my kids. He's a young kid, He didn't expect, I think, to live that long. But it's often putting away money for your family.
Do you think a lot of people, again, watching these videos, I'll say it's not necessarily hard, but stepping away from those, do you think a lot of people don't connect the dots on that or realize that at the end of the day, although these are extremely violent individuals or some of the stuff that they're doing, they are human with certain needs or certain dreams, certain aspirations, and making the best out of a bad situation?
I think when you actually understand the context in which a teenager in rural Mexico can grow up in, it makes it harder to hate them. When you realize that their educational system is broken, upward mobility in some of those places is almost impossible. The only upward mobility you have is to become a part of a cartel, which you may have become a part of when you were 13. I mean, your brain is like, you still need another, 8 years for your brain to be fully developed. And then you meet that same kid at 21 years old, and you understand where they came from and how they got there. It never, ever justifies the horrible things they've done. But it adds a bit of complexity to how you see them.
So let me ask you about this, because I've heard rumors and there's been videos, and I'd be interested in hearing your perspective and what you've heard and seen about these, whether it be migrants, whether it be poor individuals in some of the poorer cities, that they're being taken by cartels like CJNG and brought to these training camps where they're taught how to shoot a gun all the way to how to torture somebody. Can you speak to the viability of that and, I guess what is happening at some of those camps?
I haven't investigated the camps themselves, or I haven't been to one. But it is true that migrants are taken in, I think, at great numbers and recruited by the cartels, because they're kind of not even the Mexican government wants the migrants to be there. They don't want them to be crossing into the United States and making more trouble for Mexico. I think perhaps that's not fair. I'm sure the Mexican government would say that they're protecting all of the human rights of all migrants coming through the country. But whatever the case, they are being recruited into cartels, and they're gone. But that happens too with so many Mexican citizens. If you have a chemistry degree, for example, and fentanyl labs being the thing of the day, they need chemists, and they'll take chemists, and you just never return. And they have them, you might be a cook for the rest of your life, unless you try to leave and then you die. But yeah, they're recruited in, and once you're in, you don't leave. So yeah, with migrants, this kind of invisible population in Mexico, more so. They're great applicants or recruits for the cartels, though I don't know much about the training camps.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, talking about the hyper-violence, going back to that, we talked about what was the cartel's purpose with it. What is the mindset of the Mexican people with seeing, knowing, whether, majority of people have had some relative, friend, family, whatever it might be, someone they know that probably had some instance, in general, they all have an experience with it. And there's an interesting idea of maybe early on, it was new, it was something here, but this has been going on for years. Is there a sense of just numbness to the violence? Or how do the Mexican people feel about some of these violent activities that we were highlighting happening on video, being in town squares in major cities, et cetera?
Well, under the previous administration, just the outgoing administration, President AMLO, there were some of the highest homicide rates on record in the history of this country since record has been kept. And his approval rating leaving office was around 70%. So I think the violence has been normalized to such an extent that perhaps people aren't demanding the federal government do as much about it as they used to demand that they do about it. I think there is a numbness. I think there's just an acknowledgement that it's a way of life. And I think life is short as a motto. is increasingly a motto that is true in Mexico, and people recognize that. 10 people got shot up in a bar, killed in a bar recently in the state of Querétaro near Mexico City. It made news for a few days. That's 10 people just shot down with cameras, like security cameras and everything around. It was just another day in Mexico, and I think it's normalized more and more so. What the narrative the Mexican government often uses is that it was a fight between groups. So people feel like perhaps, but I'm not a part of one of those groups, so it'll never happen to me. But it just gets closer and closer and closer, and they just continue to normalize it. There is a numbness and also a dependence on these very same drug lords ordering these mass killings for justice.
So let's get into what's happening on the ground in Sinaloa with the Chapitos and the Mayo faction. I mean, the beginning of the podcast, we kind of really laid the groundwork, obviously with rumors circulating that El Chapo's son had kind of a direct connection in terms of bringing the big fish right to the U.S., and that's obviously caused a lot of issues there. So what is currently happening between the two factions on the ground, and where do you see that going over the next couple months to even years?
Well, currently, the battle between the two factions, Mayo's people and the Chapito people, is real. A lot of people are dying. It's a really tense sort of battle, and with a new president in who's trying to show that she can reduce homicides and reduce violence, and there they are kind of creating this very thing that the president needs to address. They're drawing a lot of attention to themselves. I think there are going to be new alliances. So one side or the other is going to ally with some of their previous enemies. And who wins out? Who knows? But I do know that the Mexican government has been taking on the Chapitos very publicly and taking on like the structure of the Chapito network in ways that debilitate them even more and maybe make it that much harder for them to win.
Mm-hmm. Are there other key players within Sinaloa other than those two factions that you think can either rise to prominence or are going to play a key role in whatever side wins, whether that be they're staying out of the fight, they're joining the fight on the side of Chapitos, Amaya, whatever it might be? Is there a faction within Sinaloa that a lot of eyes may be on right now?
I don't know if it's within Sinaloa. I think the Jalisco Cartel is really watching closely and will play an important role in who may win.
That's where I was going to go next. Is there's obviously a ton of other power players out there, but they might be the most powerful. Can you maybe highlight who CJNG is, both with El Mencho and just generally where they got started and kind of how, in a funny, well, not funny, but in a similar way to where we've seen the downfall of the Chapitos, they've kind of followed the opposite timeline where they've really rose to prominence in that time. So can you maybe highlight kind of their history, where they came from, and we'll bring it back to
the Chapitos or the
Jalisco New Generation?
Jalisco Cartel. Yeah, Mencho was an associate of Chapo and Mayo and a lieutenant within the Sinaloa Cartel, and then broke out on his own and seemed to take after the model of the Zetas and perfect that model of hyper-violence. He quickly gained prominence relative to how, to the control that Sinaloa Cartel has had in Mexico, the Jalisco Cartel. And they grew. I think they have like a presence in 3/4 of the country at this point, the Jalisco Cartel, and they grew in prominence, particularly through their hyper-violence. The cocaine trafficking, but also I think got really involved in human smuggling, which is increasingly lucrative, and then in the fentanyl trade. And there's, of course, been this tension, at least at the rank and file level, between the Jalisco Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel. But at some point, a relationship of convenience might make sense for one side or the other in the Mayo Chapito war for the throne. And there are suggestions that Jalisco Cartel might be able to help tip that scale.
Mm-hmm. If you're Jalisco, though, why would you want to? Isn't this an opportunity for them to establish themselves as the number one player, dominantly, whether that be let these two sides fight it out and then you come and clean up the remnants? Like, is there a possibility they're looking at it like that as well?
Perhaps. Sure. But if there's an opportunity to fold a business into your conglomerate, there's that to be considered.
Mm-hmm. So where do you, I guess looking at that then, do you see CJNG, do you see Sinaloa as we think of it now surviving the next couple of decades or next couple of years? Or do you see CJNG becoming the prominent player, the one that a lot of people think of when they look at, because when we talk cartels now, if you ask a majority of Americans, for example, they'll say Sinaloa. Like that kind of, is that 1-to-1. Sinaloa is the most powerful, whatever it might be. Do you think that CJNG will be able to establish themselves, or do you think that Sinaloa will remain, or is there another power player you think that kind of will take advantage of this power vacuum that's being created?
I don't know that there's another group that can take advantage of the power vacuum as much as the Jalisco Cartel can. It also remains to be seen how well the kids do. Are they as good as their fathers at running the Sinaloa Cartel? I don't know. I think the coin is up in the air. Mm-hmm. Because there are some really powerful factions within the Sinaloa Cartel. But that's like looking and reading into tea leaves, I think. It's really hard to know where this is all going to end. It's especially hard because you have a new president, and like understanding how she's going to approach security in the country is going to have a big impact on these.
Yeah, I've seen her mention that she wants to continue, and again, this could be incorrect, but that she's mentioned hugs, not bullets. Like she's wanted to continue that previous administration's idea. And I guess after everything, all the picture that we've kind of laid out so far, do you see that policy decision as a positive, or do you see it as a negative, or is there a bit of gray in between?
I think that there's already indications that she is going to be crack down harder on crime, meaning she's going to crack down on organized crime in a different way than her predecessor, even as she continually tries to keep very little light from appearing between the two of them. He's her mentor. So, but there are indications that that she's going to increasingly lean on the military as one retired general put it, he envisions more bullets and fewer hugs in this incoming administration. So I don't know how much hugs on bullets, but what I know she's also really focused on is investigation and intelligence. So in the past 6 years, there's been a lot. I mean, there's been this National Guard, which is basically a militarized police force, or at least the majority of the people in the National Guard are soldiers from the Army. And they have had limited training in terms of investigating crimes, yet they are the predominant security force in the country, essentially public security force. The incoming president has said she wants to have 8,000 criminal investigators, I think almost doubling the current number of law enforcement officials investigating crimes. And so, and going much more towards like an intelligence-based approach. So maybe getting to the root of crimes or solving crimes, where in a country where more that, the vast majority of crimes go unsolved. So there seems to be a public demonstration of a different tack that likely will involve more bullets. But it remains to be seen. And that's also why it's hard to say, to sort of understand the future of these two really important cartel businesses in Mexico, because it depends on how the president is going to tackle them.
Do you think there's a possibility? I guess let me get your sense of this first. Do you think this war is going to be the hottest war that we've seen between cartel factions up to this date? With everything we've laid out, with the militarization, with the hyper-violence, with the technology that they're able to utilize? And adding to that, if so, do you think that forces her hand?
Her hand? Did you say forces her hand?
Yeah, to react to it.
We can't talk about this without considering the incoming U.S. administration.
I was going to go there in a sec as well.
Because I know from talking to sources that the Sinaloa Cartel, the ones that are really thinking at a national, international level and thinking about the viability of their business and the future of it and thinking years and years ahead, like any good businessman or good business person, they're very hyper aware of what Republicans in Washington and Donald Trump have said. They're super aware of that, and they do not take it lightly. So they know that, for example, if they escalate in ways that gets the attention of the international community to a greater and greater extent, that could have a big impact on their business. We're all trying to understand, I think, what is actually rhetoric and what is actually something the incoming president is going to take action on. Will the United States bomb fentanyl laboratories? Will special forces come into Mexico and take on the cartels? Those are things that, like, some people may pass off as like it's rhetoric and it's, heated campaign. The cartel is preparing for it.
In what ways?
Increased weaponry.
Really?
That's what they're telling me. They have to take this very seriously. I mean, if you're going to be a good businessman, a good business, and it's been a viable business for the last 50 years, they've succeeded by planning ahead and adapting. Mm-hmm. And to a certain extent, they're preparing. let's just say they're not taking the situation very lightly. And they have no interest in inciting the government of the United States. So I think, to your original question, will this be, the biggest war we've seen in recent years or the last decade or something? I don't know. I think all parties involved in Mexico want to be really careful because they're not sure what Donald Trump is going to do.
I've heard from, here's the thing that's interesting with this is Donald Trump obviously is the guy that makes the call, but I've heard from many guys that I've had on this podcast, many guys that I haven't on the podcast, but I'm just, friendly with, or, who they're friendly, whatever it might be. A lot of these guys are chomping at the bit to get down there. Delta Force is one really good example that they're the type of people that can get in and out. If you want, pick whatever, boss that we're talking about, they'll go get them. They'll bring them right over, easy as can be. And they're ready to do it. So there is an idea of, although people do push that it's a campaign promise, I do feel confident that Trump's closer to that than people kind of realize. What do you think Mexico's reaction would be? And if we start having these operations take place, what dynamic does that change for the cartel? Both, as you were just highlighting, obviously the hyper-militarization and preparing for that type of battle, but what is that going to change about the way they operate?
I mean, it's just such uncharted territory. And this sort of Delta forces of Mexican cartels, one of them at least has told me they wouldn't think twice about using their biggest weapons against any U.S. force that came in. But that's, again, is that like, what does that actually mean? Because they wouldn't stand a chance against one of your,
yeah, they're going to
Delta Force interviewees. But I think, are we talking about the United States sending in forces without the permission of the Mexican government?
I'm asking both.
Because if it's without the permission of the Mexican government, I think it would do extraordinary damage to the diplomatic relationship and have an enormous economic impact on the biggest trading partner of the United States, which is Mexico. There's an enormous amount of pride. We started out about talking about the sovereignty of the country and how much this last president promoted the sovereignty of Mexico. Bear in mind, under the last Trump administration, the AMLO, the president, had the United States release a former Secretary of Defense and have him brought back to Mexico. Salvador Cienfuegos. Mm-hmm. That's an extraordinary achievement and perhaps an example of like just how much things matter to Mexico when it matters and how much they can do about it. And in this case, security experts and economists tell me that it would have a devastating impact on the economy or on the economic relationship between the two countries. It would require Mexico to respond, again, assuming, as you said, they actually went in without the permission of the Mexican government. In order for Mexico and its government to maintain self-respect, legitimacy, they would have to respond forcefully. What that response is, I don't know. But in some way, they would have to show the population that this mattered and, they don't tolerate it. Mm-hmm. Diplomatically, I think it would be devastating. As far as the cartels, Let's see, how have our wars abroad gone in the past 2 decades? Not great. And the cartels are armed with weapons not even United States citizens can have. So there's that to consider.
Do you think there's a possibility? Can Mexico say no if, because here's the thing, and this is kind of, we highlighted this at the top of the interview, with fentanyl doing what it is doing in the U.S., and it's becoming more of a main talking point with, it's happening at the border with, like I said, I'm having John Norris here in a few weeks where, there's legitimate cartel operations happening within the U.S. at this point. If the U.S. comes and says, hey, we want to do an operation to go after so-and-so, El Mayo's a great example if he was still out there, but El Mencho, whose whereabouts are unknown and who knows if he's alive type of deal. If they come and they say, hey, we're going to hit this guy, we need him done, is Mexico going to consider saying no in those situations, saying that it's something that they want to take control of? Or do you think that they're kind of fully always going to be open to saying, okay? So you see that dynamic there where it's the U.S. is asking permission, but they're also saying
this is how it's going to go down.
Yeah. Do you think that relationship's, the door's there, or that's open?
Well, remember, I said that the security cooperation between the two countries, while they might be harder to get the job done than in some other administrations, the cooperation is extraordinary. And there's a great relationship of, intelligence sharing between the two countries to take down certain targets. What I was told is the most logical thing for Mexico to do is to get ahead of this rhetoric and show the United States that they're going to make an extraordinary effort to take down or dismantle organized crime, which at this point to me seems impossible to fully dismantle it, but to get ahead of it and show that show results to the extent that it no longer is necessary for the U.S. government to even talk about taking on these sort of extrajudicial operations.
Yeah, I think many would prefer that we didn't do it, to be quite honest, because I think there's also, I avoided kind of bringing in this conversation just because we were going on different points, but, some of the things you're mentioning with the drones, some of the things you're mentioning with the landmines, there's been conversations about classifying cartels as terrorist organizations.
Right.
And that would shift the dynamic massively. I guess I'd be interested in hearing your view on that as well. But then also, yeah, with a more hardline approach, I think that would be in the best interest because that would it would help every party essentially for the U.S. not having to be as over the top, and then also, of course, Mexico. Any step towards progress is a positive step, at least. But with that terrorist question, that'd be interesting. How do you look at them? When people make that argument, do you tend to agree, or do you tend to look at it as that kind of nuance some people push, where they're operating of money, not necessarily a specific ideology that they're trying to push?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in terrorism, and I've read the arguments for these two sides for the classification of it. I only know that if they are classified as terrorist groups, the economic impact would be significant in terms of how the United States could, through NAFTA or through the current trade agreement, USMCA. I think I did.
It's one of
something like that.
Yeah.
It would have an impact on how much investment could be made in the country. I don't want to get into like whether the definition of it and whether or not it applies to the cartel, because I don't feel qualified to sort of make that declaration. I just know that the impact would be extraordinary, detrimental to the economy for sure of Mexico and the United States.
So moving forward, one of the one of the main conversations that's consistently happening with the cartels is government and journalist assassinations. Their numbers have drastically increased over, the past number of years. One of the stories that was highlighted recently going all around was, I believe it was a mayor who won election and then within 3 days was found beheaded. What is the similar to all the other hyper-violence we've talked about, what is the reaction on the ground for a lot of people with these things? And, being a journalist yourself and, working to allow the Mexican people to have, and the American people to have the truth of a lot of these situations, to really understand it. How do you look at all those as well?
The beheading of the mayor?
Just
for example,
but just the assassinations in general.
I think the beheading of the mayor is an important example of this, because it's unprecedented that the mayor of a capital city of a state, the mayor of a state capital, is assassinated in such a grotesque way, in a way that is meant to get the attention. I mean, his hair of his head was combed perfectly, like his eyes were closed perfectly. That's meant to get the attention of the general population. And it was barely a blip on the national sort of, relative to the unprecedented nature of that murder, it barely made any news at a national level compared to what I think it garnered. Mm-hmm. Just even in a place where so many homicides occur. No one was arrested for days. And I think it sent a message that even that, is perhaps how to put it. I just think that it's another example of the impunity in the country. Journalists being killed is, of course, common, and it's more dangerous. As one journalist once said, it's more dangerous to investigate a homicide of, say, a journalist than it is to commit the homicide itself. So I don't know where this ends. And everyone's hoping that this incoming president will have, with a different approach, may even reduce it slightly, or at least keep the peace, which is why these days taking out the head of a cartel is of especially great consequence, because that person being there may have meant fewer deaths. Not saying the person shouldn't be arrested and see justice, but it does result in more people dying because of the lack of rule of law. And so in the same way, people just want peace, kind of however that looks. Whether or not the rule of law is involved, they just want their children to be able to walk to school.
Looking at it, in a way, wrapping this up, how do you think the quickest way towards that type of peace is? If you had 10 years, what do you think we can do the quickest? And I know that's a massive question, but it's interesting to hear from someone that's on the ground, that is so familiar with so many of the players, understands what is really happening. for many peace, it's very simple for us to sit in the U.S. and say, well, they just get rid of the cartels. Simple. And everything's good. As you've highlighted a little bit in here, and I think reasonable people that have been listening to this will probably say the same. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. That's, it's
Right.
What do you think is the most viable and realistic option to get that closest to the peace for the Mexican people, for people that are seeing this type of violence continue to escalate daily?
Man, that is so far above my pay grade. But I would love to see an enormous amount of resources poured into addressing addiction in the United States. Addiction, let's just say to fentanyl. Like just tons of resources put into reducing the demand on the U.S. side. And then I think one of the fastest ways to target organized crime is to target their funding streams. It's just this classic follow the money thing.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things you highlighted in a number of other interviews, we kind of talked about this offline, is these cartels are starting to diversify their opportunities for profit. They're really starting to become more like businesses. We kind of highlighted that as well, talking about them utilizing government funding. What are some of the ways that these cartels are starting to do that? And, again, is there a level here where they're going to become so ingrained to some of these legal businesses that, it's difficult to separate the two, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that, I think the drop in the demand for heroin is a good example of how cartels had to diversify after one particular product was no longer in as much of demand. So the poppy fields in the mountains of Guerrero were a big and booming business. And the price for the price for, black tar or opium had dropped so significantly that there was no longer nearly as viable for the cartels to traffic heroin. With that drop, the regional cartels turned to other streams of income, and they began putting a tax on almost every aspect of people's lives. So, for example, you have a herd of cattle. You have to give 10% of your herd to the cartel every year. Every beer costs 5 pesos more, and that goes to the cartel. Every store owner has to give 15% of all of their receipts in sales to the cartel. They started to do that after the price of demand for heroin dropped.
Really?
And they diversified dramatically to everything: tortillas, chicken, meat, beef. And they started getting into the coffers of the municipal government. And so there are entire regions or cities that have the majority of sort of the functionality of that city is controlled in some way by a cartel or is taxed by the cartel. And they've created very sophisticated networks to ensure that happens. And they're making so much money, it's insane.
Do you think there's a point where, again, they move away from what it is with drug money and start, are we seeing, because I've heard this before as well, where it's like, hey, if we legalize all drugs, they just become, the number one drug distributor in Mexico legally. Is there like a lot of these cartels kind of eventually pushing to become legitimized business. I think one of the most direct examples of this would be the Cali cartel, where they were notorious for, yes, they were number 2 or number 1 for a long time in Colombia, but they invested in so many different properties and business and companies that if you looked at them, you know, you looked at their financial statements, you'd be like, oh, it's all clean money because they're real businesses. Do you think that's also where a lot of this is going, where a lot of different businesses, companies, both in the U.S. and in Mexico, are going to have foundations that are within the cartel?
They already do.
In
Mexico, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of money laundering that happens and legitimate businesses that are owned by nefarious and groups or entities. Yeah, that's pretty well established. And with the legalization of marijuana in the United States, the trafficking of marijuana from Mexico to the United States dropped dramatically, and they had to once again innovate and diversify. And one of those diversifications also was trafficking migrants.
Well, Steve, man, I really appreciate you making out the trip today. If you want to give a quick shout out, everyone can find your stuff. We'll have it linked below, but you know, just so they can check out everything that's coming out and follow up to date with a lot of the stuff that we talked about today. You know, as we highlighted off the show, I'm sure we'll have you back up here to discuss, you know, what probably in the next year when we actually see some of that stuff that we said. Who knows if it will happen? But if you want to give a quick shout out, let everyone know where to find you, whether it be social media or just your website and everything.
Yeah, you can find me at Steve L. Fisher on Twitter and stevelfisher.com on my website, and hit me up there if you have any questions.
Perfect, man. Well, I appreciate you making the trip out, and we'll get together again soon.
Thanks, Reed. Thanks for having me.